The truck yard was located in a remote area of the countryside, surrounded by sprawling fields and dense forests. It was a desolate place, with rusting vehicles, discarded tires, and heaps of garbage littering the yard. The place was known for its eerie atmosphere, and locals avoided it after dark. One evening, a truck driver named John was driving his rig through the area when his truck suddenly broke down. He pulled over to the side of the road and tried to fix the problem, but he quickly realized that he needed to find a mechanic. He remembered seeing a truck yard a few miles back and decided to head there. As he approached the yard, he saw that it was shrouded in darkness. The only light came from a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling of a dilapidated office building. John hesitated for a moment, but he had no other options. He pulled his truck into the yard and parked it near the office. As he walked towards the office, he felt a strange sense of unease. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something about the place didn't feel right. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of his footsteps on the gravel. When he reached the office, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, and the air was thick with the smell of diesel and oil. A man sat behind a desk, his face obscured by shadows. "Can I help you?" the man asked in a gruff voice. John explained his situation, and the man nodded. "I can fix it for you," he said, "but it might take a while. Why don't you go grab a bite to eat while I work on it?" John thanked the man and left the office. As he walked towards the nearby diner, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the place. It was too quiet, too empty. He was the only customer in the diner, and the waitress seemed to be avoiding him. After he finished his meal, he decided to take a walk around the yard. He thought that maybe the fresh air would clear his head and calm his nerves. As he walked, he noticed that there were no other trucks in the yard. It was just him and the mechanic. He walked past rows of abandoned vehicles, and his footsteps echoed in the silence. As he turned a corner, he saw something that made him freeze in his tracks. A figure stood at the end of the row, watching him. It was a tall, thin man with a shock of wild hair and a manic gleam in his eyes. He wore dirty overalls and held a wrench in his hand. John couldn't see his face clearly, but he felt a surge of fear run through his body. "Can I help you?" John asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, watching John with a cold intensity. John turned and walked quickly back towards the office, his heart pounding in his chest. When he reached the office, the mechanic was still working on his truck. John tried to put the encounter out of his mind and focused on getting back on the road. But as the hours passed, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The mechanic finished working on the truck and told John that he was good to go. John thanked him and climbed back into the cab of his truck. As he started the engine and pulled out of the yard, he looked back and saw the man with the wrench standing in the shadows, watching him go. The rest of the drive was uneventful, but John couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened to him at the truck yard. He tried to put it out of his mind, but he found himself replaying the encounter over and over again. Days turned into weeks, and John's experience at the truck yard faded from his mind. He went back to his normal routine, driving his truck across the country and making deliveries. But one night, he woke up in a cold sweat, his heart racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. He got out of bed and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. But there was nothing there. He went back to bed, but he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the man with the wrench from the truck yard. His mind raced with questions. Who was that man? What did he want? And why did he feel so dangerous? The next day, John decided to do some research on the truck yard. He wanted to know more about the place and the people who worked there. He searched online and found a few articles about the yard, but they didn't reveal much. The yard seemed to be a small operation, run by a handful of mechanics. But as John dug deeper, he found something that sent a chill down his spine. He found a police report from a few years ago that mentioned the truck yard. According to the report, a truck driver had gone missing in the area. His rig was found abandoned on the side of the road, and he was never seen again. John's mind raced with possibilities. Could the man he saw at the truck yard be responsible for the driver's disappearance? Was he a serial killer, preying on unsuspecting truckers who stumbled upon the yard? He tried to put the thought out of his mind, but he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. He made a decision to stay away from the truck yard, no matter what. But fate had other plans. A few months later, John found himself driving through the area again. He had no choice but to pass by the truck yard. He tried to keep his eyes on the road, but he couldn't help but glance over at the yard as he drove by. And that's when he saw something that made his blood run cold. The man with the wrench was standing by the side of the road, watching him go by. He had a wild look in his eyes, and John could see that he was holding a knife. John hit the gas and sped away as fast as he could. He could feel the man's eyes on him, watching him disappear into the distance. He drove for hours, not stopping until he was far away from the area. When he finally pulled over to catch his breath, he realized that his hands were shaking. He never went back to the truck yard again, but the memory of that night stayed with him for years. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death. The man with the wrench remained a mystery, but John couldn't help but wonder how many other truckers had encountered him and not lived to tell the tale. To this day, the truck yard remains a desolate and dangerous place, haunted by the ghosts of the past and the demons of the present. And John knows that he will never forget the terror he felt that night, driving past the yard and seeing the man with the wrench one last time. As a long-haul truck driver, John had seen his fair share of strange things on the road, but nothing had prepared him for what was about to happen. It was a dark and stormy night, and John was driving his rig on a lonely stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the wind was howling like a pack of wolves. John had been on the road for hours, and he was tired and hungry. He had planned to stop at a truck stop for dinner and a nap, but the storm had forced him to keep driving. Suddenly, John's headlights illuminated a figure in the middle of the road. It was a woman, dressed in tattered clothing and holding a sign that read, "Help." John slowed down and rolled down his window to ask if she needed a ride. The woman approached the truck and climbed inside. She was shivering and wet, and her hair was matted to her face. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been walking for hours, and I thought I was going to die out there." John nodded and turned up the heat in the cab. He asked the woman if she was hungry, and she said she hadn't eaten in days. John offered her a sandwich and a bottle of water, which she gratefully accepted. They chatted for a few minutes, and John learned that the woman's name was Sarah. She was a hitchhiker who had been stranded on the road after her car broke down. John felt sorry for her and offered to take her to the next town, where she could find a motel and get a ride to a mechanic in the morning. As they drove, John noticed that Sarah kept looking out the window nervously. He asked her if something was wrong, and she said she thought she saw something in the woods. John looked in the direction she was pointing but didn't see anything. He assumed she was just paranoid because of the storm. After an hour of driving, John saw a sign for a truck stop. He told Sarah that he needed to stop for gas and to rest for a bit. Sarah nodded, and John pulled into the parking lot. As he was filling up the tank, he noticed a group of rough-looking men eyeing his rig. John knew better than to mess with trouble, so he paid for his gas and went inside the truck stop to grab a sandwich and a cup of coffee. When he came back outside, Sarah was gone. John looked around, but he didn't see her anywhere. He assumed she had gone to the bathroom or to get some food, so he sat in the cab and waited for her. But after an hour had passed, John started to worry. He went back inside the truck stop and asked the clerk if she had seen a woman matching Sarah's description. The clerk shook her head and said she hadn't seen anyone like that. John felt a knot in his stomach. He wondered if he had been foolish to trust a hitchhiker in the middle of the night. He decided to drive back to where he had picked up Sarah to see if he could find her. As he was driving, he saw something in the distance. It was a figure in the middle of the road, and it was Sarah. John pulled over and got out of his truck. He asked Sarah where she had been, but she didn't answer. Instead, she just looked at him with a blank expression. John noticed that her clothing was torn and her face was scratched. He wondered if she had been attacked or if she had gotten lost in the woods. He asked her if she wanted to go to the police or to a hospital, but she shook her head and said she just wanted to go home. John hesitated, but he didn't want to leave her alone in the middle of nowhere. He helped her into the truck and drove her to the next town, where he found a cheap motel for her to stay in. He gave her his phone number and told her to call him if she needed anything. The next morning, John woke up to a phone call from Sarah. She was crying hysterically and telling him that she had seen something outside her motel room. John tried to calm her down and told her to stay inside until he got there. He rushed to the motel and found Sarah cowering in a corner of her room. She said she had seen a man outside her window, watching her. John decided to call the police, but when they arrived, there was no sign of the man Sarah had seen. The police took her statement and told John to keep an eye on her. John felt helpless and scared for Sarah's safety. He decided to stay with her at the motel until she felt better. As the days passed, John grew increasingly paranoid. He kept seeing strange things on the road, and he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following him. He started to think that maybe he had been targeted because of his kindness to Sarah. He began to regret picking her up in the first place. One night, John was driving through a deserted stretch of road when he saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was a man, dressed in black, with a baseball bat in his hand. John slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The man smashed the bat into the windshield, shattering the glass. John jumped out of the truck and tried to run, but the man caught up to him and tackled him to the ground. John fought back, but the man was too strong. He held John down and whispered in his ear, "You shouldn't have helped her." John's heart sank. He realized that he had been right all along. The man had been targeting him because of Sarah. He wondered what had happened to her, and if she was safe. The police arrived a few minutes later, but the man had already fled. John told them everything he knew about Sarah and the strange events that had occurred since he had picked her up. The police searched for Sarah, but they couldn't find her. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. John tried to move on from the experience, but he couldn't shake the feeling of guilt and fear. He wondered if he would ever find out what had happened to Sarah. One day, John received a phone call from the police. They had found Sarah, alive but barely. She had been kidnapped and held captive by the man who had attacked John. The police had been tracking the man for months, and they had finally found him. John felt a wave of relief wash over him. He was glad that Sarah was alive, and that the man who had hurt her was in custody. He knew that he would never forget the experience, and that it would stay with him for the rest of his life. In the end, John learned a valuable lesson about trust and the dangers of the open road. He knew that he would never pick up a hitchhiker again, and that he would always be on the lookout for danger. The experience had changed him, but he knew that he was lucky to be alive.